Now, Pontus Gedda, he had in his previous life, he was a technical manager and auditor at the Notified Body Intertek. All right, so we have somebody with real notified body experience here today. Not too long ago, he left the dark side and joined us here, and he's going to share his experience with you today on some best practices on how to obtain your MDR certificate. And what I really, really like about Pontus, as this is a guy that will give you clear answers. Okay, so all those, it depends, they don't apply to Pontus. All right, so you're going to get some straight answers from him. Pontus, it's great to have you here on the show.
Thank you, Carl. As Carl said, my name is Pontus Gedda, and I've been in this industry of medical devices for over 20 years, actually. And therefore, I call myself medical device specialist, or nerd might be a better word, actually. So today I deliver trainings, but also do consultant works regarding product development, QA/RA, and other things for medical devices. So this is who I am representing today, the company's Medical Device HQ. And the presentation I'm giving today is basically a very compressed version of an extract of my full training that is available here. But enough about me. Let's start with the takeaways that I hope you will receive today. First of all, I want you to be able to manage the requirements related to engaging with a notified body better, and understand how the road to the CE mark looks when you are using a notified body, and thereby understand how to efficiently apply for MDR assessment with a notified body. So let's start by looking at classification and some codes used under MDR. But don't worry, I will not bore you with showing all the classification rules. I think you are familiar with them. So very short then about classification of medical devices in EU. Here in EU, all devices beside pure class 1 devices requires a notified body to be involved in the conformity assessment procedure to get your products to the market. And the higher the risk class is, basically, the more involved the notified body will be. And this is what the classification rules looks like in EU. This is an extract from the MDR. You find them in Annex 8 in the MDR. And it's important to read all the rules and keep the definitions at hand when you are trying to make classification of your devices. This is especially important since at the end of this list of rules, there are some specific rules, number 14 to 22, that may actually overrule your first conclusion. So always remember that. And to help manufacturers and also notified bodies, there are some guidance documents published that are applicable in EU. For example, there are these two MDCG endorsed documents available for guidance on classification. And MDCG is short for Medical Device Coordination Group, and this is not part of the actual regulation. These are just common view of the competent authorities, basically, in Europe. So not legally binding in any way, but good information and input sometimes. So that was all I had to say about classification today. So concluding again, manufacturers of pure class 1 devices, they don't need a notified body. They shall declare their conformity with the MDR by setting up Declaration of Conformity, a so-called DOC, as defined in Article 19 of MDR. But do keep in mind, even though pure class 1 manufacturers don't need a notified body to assess their technical documentation, all manufacturers of medical devices need to have the technical documentation complete and constantly updated according to Annex 2 and 3 of the MDR. And all manufacturers of medical devices, even class 1, need to fulfill the obligations of the manufacturers as stipulated in Article 10 of the MDR. This is things like having a QMS, managing your post-market surveillance, having a risk management system, assigning UDIs, etc. That is applicable for all medical devices. So for conformity assessment for all other classes than pure class 1, it is required to involve a notified body. And there are 3 different conformity assessment procedures stipulated in the MDR for those classes of devices. So the first option is quality management system and technical documentation according to Annex 9. So this is, as it basically says, a procedure that requires the notified body to assess the full quality management system by auditing, and also call in technical documentation for assessment of the documentation related to the product. Then we have Annex 10. It's conformity assessment based on type examination. This annex is followed when the notified body does detailed examination of the actual device by inspecting and do some testing. Not very well used, actually, but we should also know that this annex cannot be used as a standalone annex and needs to be combined with some parts of the next annex, Annex 11, which is called Product Conformity Verification, Annex 11. This procedure is split into Part A and B. But both Part A and B can be used in combination with Annex 10 for the higher risk classes, or as actually stand alone for Class 2A devices. So this is quite common for 2A devices. Otherwise, Annex 9 is the most common, I would say. And the reason for that is this diagram is how I see how you can deal with the different annexes. So here we have in the blue boxes, we have the classes and the possible conformity assessment procedures. They are here in yellow, orange, and purple. And as you see here, all classes of medical devices needing a notified body can actually follow Annex 9. That's why it's most common. But as you see here, if you have 2A or 1 SMR, that is sterile measuring or reusable surgical instruments, then you can also use some parts of Annex 11. I have posted this picture on LinkedIn on my profile if you want to use it for future references. And following any of these annexes means that after the notified body has performed their activities and accepted the outcome of the conformity assessment activities, the notified body will then issue a certificate of conformance. But please note that it's not the notified body that affixes the CE mark or is now responsible for the devices in any way. It is always you as the legal manufacturer that is responsible, but you can use the number of the notified body. So that was classification and a little bit about the conformity assessment routes that are possible. So let's continue with some MDR related codes. So these are the three I'm going to present briefly to you today. We have UDI, and we have what's called MDA, MDN, and EMDN codes. So let's start with the UDI, that is Unique Device Identifier. That's what it means, and that is a new requirement in Europe, or quite new. It has been in the United States, for example, for quite a long time. And the UDI here in Europe, we can basically split it into three categories of parts. First of all, we have the basic UDI that is exclusively used in Europe. It is not used in US. So if you have already UDIs in America, for example, you can't find a corresponding basic UDI. And this is not for the actual products, it is for certificates and for registering in EUDAMED, the pan-European pan-European database on medical devices. Also, notified bodies use this to keep track of devices. And if you are filing an SSCP, that is summary of safety and clinical performance, you also need to reference this basic UDI. Then we have the UDI-DI, which is mandatory to have on the device. This is the device identifier. You normally find it on certificates also, and you need to have it in EUDAMED with your device registration. And of course, the notified bodies are interested in this. And the second part of the actual UDI is the UDI-PI, production identifier, and that is for device traceability. So it's not included in things like those above here. So you can find it on an implant card, for example, or on the actual device, if production-related data is required to be disclosed on the device, like expiry date, for example. That was all about the UDI codes for now. It is another seminar of its own. But let's look at the MDA and the MDN codes, or just normally called MDR codes, and what they are used for. These are published in the implementing regulation 2017-2185. So you will not find these codes in the actual MDR. And as you see here, it's not only MDA and MDN that I will be talking about, but also MDS and MDT. So this is what the actual regulation looks like, where you can find those codes that I will be talking about now. It's not super sexy, so I will try to explain this in a little bit more colorful way. So first, we have the MDA and MDN codes that are related to the design and intended purpose of the device. MDA codes are for active medical devices, and MDN is for non-active medical devices. And an active medical device is a device that is depending on some source of energy, except the human body or the gravity. Then we have the so-called horizontal codes. They are also divided into two categories, one for specific characteristics of the medical device, the MDS codes, and the other codes are for specific technology or processes related to the manufacturing of the medical device, the MDT codes. So when it comes to MDA and MDN codes, the manufacturer and the notified body needs to agree on one applicable product code for each device, either an MDN or an MDA code. It's actually you as the manufacturer that should state it, but you need to agree with your notified body. And for the specific characteristics codes, the MDS, it could be that no code applies, or it could be that several codes apply, depending on the characteristics of your device. And for the technologies code, the MDT, you need to specify at least one code. But for the MDT codes, there could also be several applicable codes for each device I'm talking about now. So when a manufacturer applies to a notified body, they need to specify which of these codes are applicable to each of their devices. This is done so the notified body can decide if they are designated to be able to work with those devices, meaning basically, do they have the competence to work with this? Okay, let's continue the explanation of these codes. The MDA and the MDN codes are then further divided to form 3 active subgroups and 2 non-active subgroups. Let's start now to look into the regulation that contains the actual codes. But first, let me just show you another MDCG document called MDCG 2019-14, and this is named Explanatory Note on MDR Codes. It explains this coding a little bit, and it also actually includes some examples. So this is good information when you're thinking about what codes you will have. So now we are in the actual regulation here, and this is what it looks like. And this regulation starts with the MDA codes. So the first MDA group of codes is active implantable devices. So this is where the active implantable medical devices are to be found with its 4 categories of devices. So these devices had their own directive earlier, but now they are included in MDR. Then we have the group of active non-implantable devices for imaging, monitoring, and or diagnosis with its 4 categories. Then the third group under MDA is active non-implantable therapeutic devices and general active non-implantable devices. This subgroup actually has 18 categories in it, so you only see a small part of them here. Turning now into the non-active codes, the MDN codes, and the 2 subgroups here. The MDN codes are starting with the group for non-active implants and long-term surgical invasive devices. So here we have 4 different categories of devices, which are all obviously different categories of implants. And the other MDN group then is non-active non-implantable devices. This group has actually 14 categories in it. So here you only see the 6 first one. So this is basically where we find the rest of all medical devices that we can apply. So that was the MDA and the MDN codes. So you need to find one of those. I will explain a little bit more soon. For example, if you are manufacturing contact lenses, the code for those lenses would be an MDN code, since contact lenses are non-active medical devices. Furthermore, contact lenses are not intended to be implants, since you can remove them. And then we end up in non-active, non-implantable device group. So looking into the code regulation again, under non-active, non-implantable devices, we find code MDN 1206, non-active, non-implantable ophthalmologic devices. And this is the applicable code for contact lenses. So if that is your case, I have already solved it for you. And for each medical device, only one MDA or MDN code should be assigned. But when it comes to the horizontal codes, none or more codes should be applicable for each device, as I said earlier. And as we also know now, the horizontal codes are divided into two groups, MDS and MDT. So looking into the regulation again, we find these horizontal codes, and they start with devices with specific characteristics, the MDS codes. There are 14 codes for those specific characteristics, so the list here is not complete for this group, and it is under these MDS codes where you find the different sterilization codes, for example, MDS 1005. The other horizontal codes are the MDT codes, and those are called devices with specific technologies or processes. At least one of these MDT codes per device must be applied to your specific device. The list here is not complete for this group either, since there are 13 different MDT codes. So the MDT codes basically specify how the device are manufactured. And that was the two horizontal codes. So in the case of the contact lenses that had the MDN 1206 code, the devices will also have the MDT code 2002 for devices made out of plastic materials, since that is the normal material used for contact lenses, and potentially MDS 1005 if you deliver them sterile. So if you're delivering contact lenses, these are the codes that applies to those specific devices. So as you might saw earlier here, the main reason for those codes is the designation of the notified bodies, meaning what kind of devices the notified bodies are allowed to work with. And to find the notified bodies and what codes they are designated for, you need to go to the NANDO database on the web. You just search for that and you find it. In the NANDO database, you can search for the codes applicable to your device, and the notified bodies are also listed in UDAMED only for reference, but it's here in the NANDO where the actual designation is governed and recorded. So, for example, if you are a manufacturer of X-ray machines, the applicable MDR code is MDA 0201. Then you can search for this specific code in NANDO to see which notified bodies are designated for that code. That is basically how you could find your notified bodies. So the MDR codes are relevant when applying to a notified body independent of classification, but specifically if you have class 2A devices, since those MDR codes, MDA or MDN, groups your devices for sampling decision of the notified body during their conformity assessment, meaning that the notified body needs to select at least one technical documentation sample for each MDA or MDN code for the initial technical documentation assessment of medical devices of class 2A. So that is also why they are important for you to understand. Then switching a little bit, we have the EMDN codes that are used for notified bodies. They are needed in the application and for sampling of 2B devices. I will come back to that. And also, this is data that you need to give as input into UDAMED when you specify your UDI-DI number when you register your devices. EMDN is short for European Medical Device Nomenclature, and it is stipulated in Article 26 of the MDR that there must be a specific nomenclature set up in Europe for identifying different types of devices. And those codes, EMDN codes, are also not possible to find in the MDR itself. Rather, they are published on a specific website, actually. But luckily, there is also an MDCG endorsed document that clarifies this. So let's have a quick look into this specific MDCG document. It's 2021-12, and it's called FAQ, Frequently Asked Question on the European Medical Device Nomenclature, EMDN. So looking into this MDCG document, we see that each alphanumeric code, meaning the actual EMDN code, then begins with a letter referring to the category of which the device falls under, followed by 2 numbers indicating the group, and a series of numbers which refer to the type. And the more numbers you define, the more specific the definition of the device will be. So the maximum number of characters for a EMDN code is thereby set to 13. And all EMDN code starts with a letter, as I said, a letter. So when you then need to find the applicable code for a specific type of device, you can visit the EMDN webpage. It looks like this, and either search directly here in the search field, or you can browse your way down in the tree here. So then you can expand the trees in the structure to give you more specific devices. So as an example, let's say we want to find the EMDN code for multiple clip appliers for open surgery. Such a device is used for applying clips instead of traditional sutures to close a wound or a vessel during an open surgery procedure. So if we read through the categories, which is defined by the letter of the EMDN code, going through the categories, we find letter H as the category for suture device. So this is some kind of suture device. Then the first 2 digits sets the group, level 2, and then we find O3 as the group hemostasis clips. And on the level 3, the 3rd and 4th digit, we find hemostasis clips for open surgery. And then finally, we find at level 4, the devices we were looking for. So the EMDN code here would be H030101. Then for some devices, we can continue further to level 5 up to level 6 for even further detailing the devices. But in this example, we stop at level 4. This since the 4th level is related to the sampling of class 2B products for notified body conformity assessment. So to summarize this, EMDN codes are relevant for EUDAMED for device registration, but also when applying to a notified body, especially if you have class 2B devices. This since the notified body, they group the class 2B devices based on the EMDN code at the 4th level. So initial TD assessment by the notified body, during that they need to pick at least 1 sample for each EMDN code on the 4th level. But when you're registering your device in EUDAMED or reporting vigilance, you shall assign the most granular and terminal term available, meaning the lowest applicable level of code in the tree structure, meaning going as far as possible on the web page where devices are defined with the EMDN codes, as I just showed. That was the MDR related codes. Let's talk a little bit more about the notified bodies. Since the notified bodies are a bit of an odd stakeholder, they have their own chapters and annexes in the MDR for their requirements. So I will not go into details about those requirements, but I do strongly recommend you to read at least section 4 of Annex 7. Quite boring, but it is worth the effort, because this explains how the notified body shall act in relation to the manufacturer for their application, onboarding, and certification under MDR. So let's say you have now found a notified body that have the applicable MDA, MDN, MDT, and MDS codes that I just explained. Then the application process, which is a bit complex, is divided in several steps. Those typical steps are laid out here. So let's start with the so-called pre-application. So at this stage, the notified body must verify preliminary that the medical device from the manufacturer that is applying covered in this pre-application actually are medical devices according to MDR, and that the classification is correct, and that the conformity assessment procedure chosen is applicable and included in the notified body's scope. Then the next step would then normally be a confirmation from the notified body back to the applying manufacturer that they can proceed with the formal application and potentially some kind of estimate on the cost for the upcoming project. And here the notified body typically sends an application package to the manufacturer, including the forms to fill in for the formal application package. The manufacturers should then fill out the application forms, of course, and potential amendments with all relevant available data. And typically the application will request data shown here, including, of course, a signature from the applicant. And the rest of the information is normally asked for as a separate document with specific data requirements. So let's have a look at what that would be. So this is normal information here. And here you see an example of what will typically be asked for by the notified body for each medical device that is included in the application. And all this information is needed for the notified body to assess the application and to ensure it is designated for all the applied products, and to ensure that the manufacturer has all data available and correct, of course. So here we see those MDR codes and EMDN codes and the basic UDI, DI, and DI. The notified body now need to thoroughly go through all this data in the application to ensure that the data is, of course, available, correct, and that the notified body also have the competence available of personnel to perform the activities covered by the application. So that is a requirement. Therefore, this step is often preceded by several communications between the applicant and the notified body to clear things out. So be prepared for quite a lengthy application process, or make sure to answer all the questions correctly in the first time to speed it all up. So don't leave out and to be decided and things like that, because then you will end up lost in the queue again. The next step will then be for the notified body to set up a proposal for an agreement. But before the notified body can set up the proposal for the agreement, they need to calculate, of course, the duration of the initial audit activities and the technical documentation assessment for initial MDR certification. And of course, all coming activities within the certification cycle. So this is again where the MDA and MDN and the EMDN codes come into play, because that will basically decide how many technical files the notified body needs to call in before they can give you the first certificate. So, as you might understand, it takes quite a bit of knowledge and understanding about the manufacturer from the notified body's side and the products, and of course, time to set up this proposal and the agreement. Then, when all this finally is in place and both the manufacturer and the notified body has signed the agreement, the actual conformity assessment can start. So here we are now, the conformity assessment process. As you might already understand, the purpose of the conformity assessment is to get an EC certificate or a COC, certificate of conformance. And the maximum validity or length of a notified body certificate is 5 years according to MDR, meaning that the normal conformity assessment cycle is also 5 years. And the MDR requirements for the notified body conformity assessment, they are a bit spread out in the MDR, and the bases are found in Article 52 with reference to the 3 different conformity assessment procedures in Annex 9 and 11, 211. And then how the conformity assessment then is actually done is best described in Annex 7, Section 4.5, as I mentioned earlier. But reading the text of MDR is too boring, so let's illustrate it like this instead. As I said, the normal conformity assessment cycle is 5 years, and such a cycle can be illustrated like here. I will also post this picture on LinkedIn after this presentation if you like to have it for future references. So the start of the initial conformity assessment. So this is the first time you are getting your EC certificate. This is the manufacturer's application, as we just discussed. Then, based on the application data, the notified body should be able to set up a so-called 5-year plan that shall cover all planned activities for the coming certification cycle. The 5-year plan then needs to be continuously updated by the notified body during this cycle. So, by default, initial certification requires a QMS on-site audit, quality management system on-site audit, and some initial technical documentation assessment. So the initial QMS audit, where the notified body comes and visits you, is composed of a stage 1 audit, where the notified body basically ensures that the manufacturer's QMS covers all the applicable requirements of the MDR. And this stage 1 audit duration is typically around 30% of the complete initial audit time. So meaning that stage 2, the next activity, is about 70%. And based on the output of stage 1, the notified body then decides when the stage 2, or also called certification audit, is to be conducted. But before stage 2 audit is performed, the initial TD assessment, the technical documentation assessment, shall be done and reported to the client, and also form input to the stage 2 audit. And as you might now understand, this timing here can sometimes be a bit tricky for the notified body, and potentially, of course, leads to delay. This, since the output of the technical documentation assessment is depending very much on the quality of the technical documentation sent in by the manufacturer, you. So my best tip to all of you is to send in only complete and well-structured technical documentation, which I will come back to soon. So when the stage 2 audit has been performed also on site, and any non-conformities have been properly addressed, and the initial TD assessment is reported, and any potential non-conformities from that one have been properly addressed by the manufacturer, then the first MDR, certificate of conformance, can be granted to the manufacturer by the notified body. And you can start to see mark your devices with the notified body identification number. So the extent of initial and coming audit activities to be performed by the notified body is normally depending on the size of the manufacturer and, of course, the extent of their quality management system. For a manufacturer with approximately 10 employees, or even also called FTEs, full-time equivalents, the initial audit will take something like 5 days in total, and for a manufacturer with 100 employees, approximately the double, around 10 days. So if you have 100 employees, maybe 3 days for stage 1 and 7 days for the stage 2, approximately. And the number of technical documentation to be sampled here now at initial certification is depending on the portfolio range, of course, and the classes, but also on the diversity, since sampling is done depending on how much difference there is in the products covered by the certificate. So again, this is where the MDA, MDN codes and the EMDN codes on the 4th level comes into the picture. And as you see, for class 3 devices, all technical documentation shall be reviewed before certification. That was the initial certification. Then within 12 months of the certification date, the notified body needs to perform the first annual surveillance audit. And once again, there should be a TD assessment performed in conjunction with this audit. And the requirements for the notified body with regards to the TD assessment is actually that the technical documentation shall be sampled and assessed yearly until the full range of manufacturers' devices have been covered. So constantly each year calling in new technical documentation until everything is done. When during the certification cycle, the full range of devices of the manufacturer has already been assessed, you don't have any more products, then, and there is still time left in the certification cycle, the notified body shall focus on the technical documentation relating to post-market surveillance during the upcoming remaining audits in that cycle. So when no more TD sampling is to be done, the focus will be the PMS-related documentation during the audits. So maybe a little bit longer audits if everything is already sampled with the technical documentation. And the coming surveillance audit shall then also be done within 12 months after the previous audit. And these surveillance audits shall also cover potential critical supplier audits as decided and included in the notified body's 5-year program. And a supplier audit can also be required with the initial stage 2 audit, of course, if everything is outsourced. And at least one unannounced audit shall be done by the notified body during each certification cycle. So once every 5 years at least, you will have an unannounced audit. Also, during the certification cycle, the manufacturer is obliged to report changes in their QMS or in their organization or in their product portfolio to the notified body. and also any potential vigilance and mandatory PSURs, periodic safety update reports, shall be reported to the notified body. So all this information also serves as input to the notified body's 5-year plan and can be potential triggers then for extra TD assessment, special assessment, extra audits, or unannounced audits. And unannounced audits can also be done by the notified body to the manufacturer's suppliers. And unannounced audits under MDR shall normally include the notified body to perform or witness an actual product test. And before the end of a certification cycle, the notified body would need a new application from the manufacturer to request recertification. That is not automatic. You need to request that. And this application could basically be as extensive as the initial formal application, but not necessarily, of course, depending on potential changes. The notified body then needs to perform a recertification audit again, or like the stage 2 audit, to be able to prolong the EC certificate with a new 5-year validity. And the extent of that recertification audit should basically be the same as for the stage 2. And before the certificate will get a new 5-year validity, the notified body also needs to ensure that everything according to the initial 5-year plan has been performed as it should be. So then, when the manufacturer requests the recertification to the notified body, now the notified body also needs to set up a new 5-year plan to plan the activities for the coming certification cycle, which will basically need to include to do everything that was in the first cycle all over again, meaning calling in technical documentation again and perform new regular and unannounced audits. So the fun never ends. So let's now talk a bit about the technical documentation that I said was crucial to get it right the first time. As I mentioned, yes, a well-structured technical file is very important. To facilitate this, it is required that the technical documentation from the manufacturer includes at least all the elements of Annex 2 and 3 in the MDR. And before we get into the details of what must be included in the technical documentation according to those annexes, I would like to highlight this requirement from Annex 2. It says that the technical documentation shall be clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous. Those of you that already have technical documentation set up, you might need to carefully consider if you're actually fulfilling all those requirements. Especially the requirements to make it searchable, meaning that, for example, PDFs need to be PDFs printed from editable documents, or you would have to run maybe like optical character recognition on the documents, so if they are scanned from paper copies. And the required context of the technical documentation according to Annex 2 is divided into 6 sections like this. And please note that even if Annex 2 is structured like this, some notified bodies have their specific required structure of the technical documentation. So if your notified body if your technical documentation is to be reviewed by the notified body, it's always wise to check if your notified body have any more specific requirements on the structure and content of the technical documentation. And if they don't have, there is always this best practice guide published by Team NB. But Team NB has no like regulatory power. They rather reflects the common interpretation of this group of notified bodies. So this is good input on how to structure your technical documentation, but it's not a legal requirement. And this is how I structure a technical file when I help my clients. I do set up an expandable Excel file with the sections defined in Annex 2 of the MDR plus some other for ease of grouping, basically according to the Team NB position paper I just showed you. And then under each section, I identify the ID of the documents and their name, together with the revision of the document and also potential comments. Like in this example, under section 1, I have the product list, and then I have what is called classification rationale and the generic product description and the complete list of UDIs, DIs that are covered by this technical documentation. Then the actual technical file is structured according to the Excel document. So when sending in the TD to the notified body, I compress all these folders and send in one zipped file. So here we have the different sections, and they are corresponding to this Excel document. So it will be hopefully very easy for the notified body to find what they are looking for. As I said, there are 6 parts that needs to be covered according to Annex 2. I will not go through them all here, but let's look quickly into section 4, the GSPRs. This 4th section is where the manufacturer needs to demonstrate how they are conforming to each of the applicable GSPR. GSPR is general safety and performance requirement. These are basically applicable for all. The GSPRs are found here in Annex 1 of the MDR, and here the manufacturer must include clear reference to the solutions applied to fulfill all the applicable GSPRs that are related to them. And for the GSPRs that are not applicable, a clear rationale shall be provided why that is the case. And this is where the manufacturer would usually use a so-called GSPR checklist. The technical documentation must, as I said, provide clear references to how the GSPRs have been fulfilled. It can't be just a tick box saying, yeah, it's fulfilled. And for this purpose, the GSPR checklist is a good tool or structure to show how you meet these GSPRs. And remember that all GSPRs are basically equally applicable independent on class of your devices. So here it's very important that you have good references to actual documents that is included in your technical file according to the Excel I just showed. Then we have risk management part of the technical documentation, which is equally important, but unfortunately I don't have time for that right now, but my colleague Carl will talk a little bit about risk management later, even if I love risk management. And the 6th and last section is where the manufacturer shall document the product verification and validations. So here there should be references to quite a lot of verification documentations like test protocols and study reports. The product validation will also be the basis for the clinical evaluation. And my personal opinion is that it's under this section where the most manufacturers would receive the most non-conformities from the notified bodies, especially the clinical evaluation. And with that cheerful message, I end this presentation exactly on time. And thanks a lot for listening. And if you thought this was a bit quick, you will find the whole course related to MDR on Medical Device HQ. And there I have a much more moderate tempo in the presentation, and it's much more comprehensive. So thank you for listening, and back to you, Carl.
Well, we can hear people applauding all over the world. Thank you very much for this presentation. As you know, everybody who's been here before, these presentations are being recorded. We're going to put them on our website. You can find it on our YouTube channel. But of course, it's never going to be as good as to get it from the horse's mouth. So go and sign up for Pontus' course and become a real expert on this. A great presentation. I have a question for you there. You showed us this, all the involvement that a medical device manufacturer has actually with a notified body throughout this 5-year period. There was tons of boxes there. So there's tons of work going into there. I mean, who is paying for this? Who's paying for all this?
You are.
I was afraid of that.
That is the manufacturers. That's why it is so basically so expensive. I mean, lining up with notified body, it's quite costly. They take a lot of like tens of euros a day for the audits, and maybe 10,000 euros plus maybe 20,000 euros for technical documentation. But it's not only that work, it's everything here, the planning and the onboarding and all the administration and the designation. It costs like 100,000 euros plus to be designated just in costs. So it's very expensive to run a notified body, and someone has to pay, and it is unfortunately the manufacturers.
All right. So when, like in step 2, there was this, you get a quote, right? It says that you make an application, you get a quote. what does that quote include? Is that just the first couple of boxes there, or is it all, for all the 5 years?
I mean, it should be, in my opinion. I mean, when I was manager for the notified body, we always made quote for the whole cycle. But the minimum you should see is at least an estimate of what is the cost for initial audit, because you need to know how much time will they spend, how many days do I need to pay for the audit, and how many technical documentations do you need to call in, and what is the price for a technical documentation assessment. So in my opinion, as a client, you should require the notified body to give you a proper proposal, and you should also ask what is the estimated cost for the 5-year cycle.
Okay, thank you very much, Pontus. Again, everybody, hook up with Pontus on LinkedIn, and you will get the latest and greatest from him throughout time.